Mr. Vyas discovered that when Wells Fargo customers experienced fraud or unauthorized activity on an account, Wells Fargo failed to adequately investigate the fraud and instead closed the account under the pretext of a business decision, leaving its customer to absorb the loss for any unauthorized withdrawals. Mr. Vyas personally helped to uncover the now publicly known Wells Fargo scheme involving an internal fraud ring used by branch employees to create fake customer accounts. By filing this lawsuit, Mr. Vyas becomes the first person to finally expose Wells Fargo's fraud victim account closure scandal to the public. Our next story is kind of a terrible one. Wells Fargo's been hit with yet another lawsuit, this time to avoid paying back people who have been victims of fraud. Let's put it that way. This case is actually a civil lawsuit for whistleblower retaliation, aiding and abetting, damages of $20 million. Matthew Vyas is a bank fraud investigator. Until January 2018, Mr. Vyas worked as a financial crimes specialist in Wells Fargo's Portland area loss prevention line of business referrals unit. Last month, Wells Fargo and Mr. Vyas's supervisor, Kimberly Thrush, decided to terminate his employment. Prior to his termination, Mr. Vyas had repeatedly complained to Wells Fargo management about what he believed was an illegal and systematic scheme to prematurely close certain customer accounts. Soon after transferring into the loss prevention line of business referrals unit, Mr. Vyas discovered that when Wells Fargo customers experienced fraud or unauthorized activity on an account, Wells Fargo failed to adequately investigate the fraud and instead closed the account under the pretext of a business decision, leaving its customer to absorb the loss for any unauthorized withdrawals. Wells Fargo customers have long complained that after being victimized by account fraud or suffering identity theft, their accounts were closed for no legitimate reason. Last year, federal authorities investigated accusations that Wells Fargo was wrongfully closing accounts of fraud victims, but until now, no proof existed to substantiate the accusations. By filing this lawsuit, Mr. Vyas becomes the first person to finally expose Wells Fargo's fraud victim account closure scandal to the public. In or around 2009 to 2010, Mr. Vyas was employed in the banking industry at American Express. While at American Express, Mr. Vyas received regular promotions and raises. He left American Express to become Financial Crimes Specialist 2 in the Internet Service Group Online Fraud Operations Unit with Wells Fargo in Salt Lake City in February 2011. As a Financial Crime Specialist 2, Mr. Vyas investigated reports of online fraud pertaining to Wells Fargo customer savings accounts, checking accounts, and credit accounts. After a year or so of this position, he was promoted to Specialist 3. While at the Internet Service Group Online Fraud Operations Unit, Mr. Vyas personally helped to uncover the now publicly known Wells Fargo scheme involving an internal fraud ring used by branch employees to create fake customer accounts. As a result of Mr. Vyas's contributions and positive work record, the Internet Services Group Online Fraud Operations Unit tasked him with providing training to other Wells Fargo investigators. The same unit began grooming Mr. Vyas to be a team lead, and he had the opportunity to take a higher position within the office. Rather than take the higher position, he turned down the team lead in online fraud to pursue a Portland, Oregon position. The Portland office would allow Mr. Vyas to become familiar with various types of bank fraud, not just online fraud, as he had investigated in the Internet Service Group. Mr. Vyas was told by his supervisors that the new position in Portland would give him broader knowledge of various types of fraud that would ultimately help him promote higher within Wells Fargo. In or around November 2014, he was hired for the new position, relocated to Portland, Oregon. In his new position, he worked with investigators in the loss prevention line of business referrals to investigate internal fraud referrals submitted by Wells Fargo employees to a confidential internal database. Wells Fargo's loss prevention line of business referrals unit investigated instances of alleged fraud on both consumer and business deposit and savings accounts. Almost immediately upon starting his new position, Mr. Vyas became concerned about the internal culture of the loss prevention unit. Mr. Vyas soon discovered that the apparent directive of the loss prevention unit, as directed by management, was to meet Wells Fargo's metrics at all costs, even if it meant failing to adequately investigate instances of fraud on accounts belonging to Wells Fargo's customers. By failing to adequately investigate internal fraud referrals as the law required, the loss prevention unit unfairly shifted losses caused by fraud to Wells Fargo's own customers, many of whom had been victims of identity theft and unauthorized transactions. Rather than conduct a thorough investigation into the claims of fraud, Mr. Vyas began to notice that Wells Fargo would instead save money by simply closing the accounts under the pretext of a business decision to close. Improperly closing customer accounts in this manner assured that customers not Wells Fargo were left to absorb the costs of fraudulent activities and unauthorized withdrawals from their checking and savings accounts. The decision by Wells Fargo's loss prevention unit to prematurely close accounts also unfairly harmed customers' credit in cases where fraud had caused an account to become overdrawn. In or around 2015, Mr. Vyas suffered a serious health event that caused him to become hospitalized. He was approved for leave by Wells Fargo Human Resources for April and June of 2015 and a few days in July. After his hospitalization, he was treated worse than other employees by his supervisor. They refused to train him in retaliation for his requests for leave. Soon after Mr. Vyas returned to work, he complained to Human Resources about Wells Fargo's illegal failure to properly investigate reports of fraud and Wells Fargo's illegal behavior in wrongfully closing customer accounts. Wells Fargo's behavior violated various regulations and laws, including several in Oregon, the Consumer Financial Protection Act, the Dodd-Frank Act, and a 15 U.S.C. Section 45 law which prohibits unfair and deceptive acts or practices in or affecting commerce. Mr. Vyas also complained about illegal retaliation from Mr. Lee, his supervisor, based on Mr. Vyas's hospitalization and medical leave. Mr. Vyas was told on several occasions that the potentially unlawful behavior he reported would be investigated and addressed. The loss prevention unit was later investigated, and Mr. Lee was transferred out of the unit. Mr. Lee was transferred from the loss prevention unit, and afterward Ms. Thrush was transferred in to become Mr. Vyas's supervisor. Mr. Vyas immediately noticed that Ms. Thrush was hostile towards him. Ms. Thrush proceeded to try to isolate Mr. Vyas from the work of the unit. She treated him worse than other employees and would not allow him to get necessary training to work on advanced fraud issues, severely limiting the type of work he was able to do. Ms. Thrush was unusually concerned with Mr. Vyas and her ability to control him. To that end, Ms. Thrush would not allow Mr. Vyas to work remotely or use a laptop for work. In addition, Mr. Vyas was denied opportunities for overtime and promotions while supervised by Ms. Thrush. Ultimately, Mr. Vyas had to take a number of subsequent medical leaves due to his serious health condition. Each time Mr. Vyas returned from the leave, he observed Ms. Thrush becoming more hostile towards him. Mr. Vyas requested minor schedule changes in order to accommodate his medical conditions, but this was consistently refused. Ms. Thrush, however, knew that she had to be careful not to take certain actions against Mr. Vyas close in time to his medical leave. She attempted to discipline him because he was cooperating too much with law enforcement, seeking information about fraud that took place on one particular customer's account. During the call with law enforcement official Detective Carson, Mr. Vyas was attempting to gather more information to help determine whether the alleged fraudulent activity was customer-related or the behavior of a third-party criminal. Instead of encouraging Mr. Vyas for conducting a proper investigation to find out the truth, Ms. Thrush reprimanded Mr. Vyas and accused him of breaching security protocol by providing Detective Carson with the Wells Fargo account number at issue. Mr. Vyas pointed out that he had not breached security protocol and never provided an account number to law enforcement. Regardless, Ms. Thrush persisted in reprimanding Mr. Vyas. Ms. Thrush's baseless reprimand for speaking with law enforcement confirmed Mr. Vyas's belief that Wells Fargo's loss prevention line of business referrals unit does not have a commitment to thoroughly investigating fraudulent account activity on customer accounts. Mr. Vyas contacted Wells Fargo Human Resources and complained that he had been improperly written up. Human Resources lowered the final warning to a regular warning. Mr. Vyas knew he did nothing wrong and intended to challenge the regular warning but was unable to because of his medical condition, again requiring him to leave work. Undeterred, he returned to Wells Fargo as soon as his health permitted and continued working without incident as a financial crime specialist number 3 in its Portland-based loss prevention line of business referrals unit. Then, in or around December 2017, Mr. Vyas applied to transfer back to Salt Lake City away from the illegal and unethical practices of the Portland unit. Mr. Vyas reported to his former Salt Lake City supervisor about some of the issues he witnessed in the Portland unit. Mr. Vyas was later scheduled for an interview in Salt Lake City, and given his exemplary record there, his former supervisor indicated that he was the best candidate. On or about January 9, 2018, Wells Fargo and Ms. Thrush further retaliated against Mr. Vyas by terminating his employment. Ms. Thrush lied and said Mr. Vyas was terminated because he had committed another security violation. Wells Fargo claimed that Mr. Vyas allegedly violated its security rules by leaving his notebook on his desk, which contained an internal case number. Wells Fargo's stated reason for terminating Mr. Vyas was just a pretext, a convenient echo of other baseless security violations that Ms. Thrush fabricated early on in Mr. Vyas's employment in the loss prevention line of business referrals unit, so the pretext would appear more plausible. Unlike co-workers who had not previously reported unlawful activity and retaliation for protected medical leave, Wells Fargo did not give Mr. Vyas a warning or a second chance. Wells Fargo does not usually terminate an employee for such a minor commonplace mistake. Wells Fargo did not adhere to its own policies and procedures with regard to purported security violations. In reality, Wells Fargo terminated Mr. Vyas' employment in substantial part because of his reporting of retaliation for taking protected medical leave and his decision to internally blow the whistle on Wells Fargo's fraud victim unit account closure scheme. Ms. Thrush had a history of wrongfully terminating whistleblowers, and she understood the legal importance of how to time a termination based on a plausible pretext to avoid detection. Due to his wrongful termination, Mr. Vyas was prevented from transferring back to the Salt Lake City unit. As a proximate and direct result of Wells Fargo's adverse employment behavior, Mr. Vyas has suffered ongoing emotional distress, including stress, anxiety, embarrassment, harm to reputation, and other harmful and negative emotions. Mr. Vyas is without a job, and his employment record has been forever tarnished. Mr. Vyas left a good position in Salt Lake City with the opportunity for advancement and uprooted his life to take the position in Portland at Wells Fargo's loss prevention line of business referrals unit. Mr. Vyas reserves the right for the jury to allow punitive damages of up to $180 million against Wells Fargo based on evidence that Wells Fargo's behavior was malicious. Mr. Vyas is now at a loss as to what to do next and fears that Wells Fargo's wrongful termination will limit his ability to get another job. In a filing dated August 4, 2017, Wells Fargo disclosed to the public that it was under investigation for the very account closure scheme Mr. Vyas had internally blown the whistle about, as alleged in this complaint. Wells Fargo's disclosure is below. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has commenced an investigation into whether customers were unduly harmed by the company's procedures regarding the freezing of, and in many cases closing of, consumer deposit accounts after the company detected suspected fraudulent activity by third parties or by account holders that affected those customers. A review of consumer complaints filed with the CFPB substantiates Wells Fargo's fraud victim account closure scheme. And so he files for claims of whistleblower retaliation in the non-economic losses of $20 million. He accuses Kimberly Thrush of aiding and abetting, and therefore she is personally liable for up to the $20 million. He asks for an injunction stopping Wells Fargo from retaliating against himself or anyone else similarly so situated, a judgment holding Wells Fargo liable for retaliating against him, a judgment against Wells Fargo allowing actual damages of $20 million plus interest and fees, costs, expenses, and other equitable relief. Very interesting. So we knew that Wells Fargo was doing some pretty scummy things with opening, multiple accounts in people's names so that they could... I don't even know what that does. Does that make their numbers look better or something? I don't even know. Was there then fraud going on under all of those things? Somebody remind me what all that was. But the point is that we already knew that Wells Fargo was kind of scummy because of all those accounts that they opened. And then while all that's going on, people who reported fraud, legitimate third-party fraud, some of them would actually get their accounts closed so that Wells Fargo didn't have to pay back the fraud, which is something that they promise, by the way. Usually, and you have to make sure that they do this, but when you go to a bank and you get a regular debit or credit account, make sure that they cover fraud losses, because that's not your fault. Hello, Equifax? Does not everybody in the United States now not have all of their financial information totally out there thanks to Equifax? So why is that my fault? That's not my fault. That's not my problem. You guys didn't keep tabs on your stuff, so that's your problem. You take care of that. Goodbye. That's just, that's really scummy. That is a level, I don't even understand how a bank can expect to stay in business and do that to their customers. I would be absolutely livid if I was a Wells Fargo customer. Just a reminder that it's annual credit report. Is it annualcreditreport.com? Let me bring it up. Here is annualcreditreport.com. So this is required by law. They have to do this because they collect such detailed information on you. Thank you all. Love you. We've hit you with the whole Patreon and the support and everything already, so I'm not going to go through all of that, other than to say thank you very much to my $50 plus supporters. There are, I think, 10 of you. DJ Gilcrease, John Steele, Gavin Barnard, The Godslain, Evie, Andy, Kyle Mudrak, John H. Anderson, Vera Montaigne, and Sean McNamara. You're going to get your own... I'm going to make an animation thing like I did with this fly-in here. In fact, I already made it. I just didn't export it for the stream. It'll be done. But I'm gonna make some fun stuff for you because you guys are supporting at such a level that it's really making a huge difference. Also, we have 200 $5 plus supporters. You guys are also absolutely amazing. Do you know what 200 times 5 is? That's $1,000 a month you guys are donating. I'm also going to be updating the graphic animations and stuff for you there. And we're considering different tiers or other rewards. I want to add additional rewards for the existing tiers as well as add new tiers with new rewards. We'll figure it out. I don't want to do it in any way that upsets anyone, though, which is why we're not doing it quickly. So we're going to talk about it first. And I'm just going to thank you a whole lot, like I always do, because you really are that great. So I do love you all. I'm going to let you go now. Have a great day. I am your favorite copyright attorney, Leonard French, and I will see you on my next stream or on YouTube on the next video. Love you. Bye.